Just pleased he didn't say that I was one of Australia's best-known twits, which I have been referred to as previously. The transformative effect of what I'm calling New Journalism 2.0. After surveying 25 tweeting journalists in 2009 and devoting many hours to active research as a tweeter myself, I concluded that the capacity to do Twitter journalism is one of the new essential tools in a journalist's kit bag. And as a platform to aid research, to report news that's breaking, to distribute stories, to build new audiences, and very importantly, to engage with those audiences, they being other tweeters. To some journalists, Twitter's like a favourite watering hole, a public pub debriefing zone, if you like. To others, it's a public notepad, a public journalist's notepad, which exposes the practices and processes of journalism to audiences, enhancing the craft's transparency. And it's also viewed by some as a live contact book. So journalists see fellow tweeters as potential sources, as potential collaborators in the journalistic process. By the end of 2009, I'd concluded that Twitter was actually having a transformative effect on Australian journalism. And what became known simply by the hashtag spill, which was the ousting of Malcolm Turnbull from the Liberal leadership after a leadership spill. Ultimately, that spill was won by Tony Abbott. That spill led me to tweet this. And this is New Journalism 2.0, where practice and journalistic process are laid bare in real time. As a result of that Conservative leadership spill, which really was probably the 2 weeks, the longest 2 weeks rather, in the history of the Liberal National Coalition. But it also highlighted the emergence of a new form of political communication via Twitter. This was characterised by instant, multi-contributor, user-controlled information feeds. Canberra Press Gallery journalists poured onto the platform, and political watchers were glued to journalists' Twitter feeds. A politically engaged Twitter electorate was taken directly into the eye of the storm by journalists live tweeting every twist and turn within the halls of power, and they interacted with their followers in the process. In the immediate aftermath of the leadership spill, in December 2009, I surveyed 8 prominent tweeting Canberra Press Gallery journalists about their experiences of covering that story, with Twitter being at the centre of the coverage for some. Their responses and my ongoing assessment of Twitter's use by journalists and for journalistic purposes have strengthened my hypothesis that Twitter is having a transformative effect or impact on journalism. And this is taking place, of course, against a backdrop of industry upheaval and increasing audience demands for engagement with both journalists and around the stories on which they report. And this has become very clear as I observed and actively participated in this bill coverage as a content curator and commentator, which is one of the key roles that journalists are adopting, this idea of curating information on Twitter. What did the journalists do? The spill. They live tweeted from media conferences. They posted pictures to illustrate the atmospherics. They offered opinions. They monitored key political players' Twitter feeds. They linked to their employers' content, so longer form stories and analysis were linked out via Twitter. They discussed story updates and journalistic processes with their colleagues, competitors and followers. They interacted with the public and they posed questions to politicians or passed comments directed at them via the medium. So here are my preliminary findings from this case study on the spill. Firstly, Twitter has potential as a vehicle for democracy in Australia, as a platform for unmediated interaction between political journalists, engaged citizens and politicians. The aggregation of spill tweets under one hashtag, that being the word spill, had a levelling effect. The tweets of Press Gallery journalists intermingled with those of political scientists, of politicians, of bloggers, and ordinary citizens who were using Twitter as a platform for democratic participation. This was a point acknowledged by Crikey's Bernard Keane. He is the Canberra political correspondent for Crikey. He described the effect as a flattener, an ironing out of the differences between members of the public and those even on the other side of the world, and veteran insiders within Parliament House. The process also facilitated engagement between non-press gallery commentators and observers, both professional and amateur, along with gallery journalists. And along with citizens and journalists, the third essential prong for democratic engagement is the politicians themselves. During the spill, one of the Conservative leadership contenders, Joe Hockey MP, interacted with constituents via Twitter. In fact, he asked them what to do, essentially, about the leadership competition. Although too many Australian politicians use Twitter like it's just an old telex service for distributing very short press releases, bearing in mind that each tweet is, of course, only 140 characters long. One of their objectives in using the medium, the politicians' objectives that is to bypass traditional information gatekeepers, they being the journalists. Ironically, instead, they've found themselves entwined with journalists in what's really a three-way political communication process, which is ultimately controlled by the voters. Instead of being held to account only by professional journalists, some politicians are finding that they're being accosted and questioned, corrected and challenged by active citizens using the platform. In the race to tweet, journalists are knocking down the walls that have in the past segregated media outlets within the press gallery. This is happening via content sharing and cross-pollination between fiercely competitive commercial and public broadcast networks, newspapers and wire services. Annabelle Crabb, who was with the Sydney Morning Herald and is now the chief political correspondent online for ABC, said, "I'll happily retweet a competitor's update if I think my readers will find it interesting." She told me, "I think this is an interesting and refreshing trend." That's something I absolutely agree with. David Spears, who's the chief political reporter for Sky News, during the first spill, and I'm calling it the first spill because, of course, the second spill resulted in Kevin Rudd's ousting as Prime Minister and replacement with Julia Gillard. During the first spill, for the first time, we saw David Spears live on Sky News rolling coverage, using his mobile phone to cite the tweets of journalists from competing media outfits live to air. We also saw something pretty extraordinary to a former ABC journalist, and that was an aggregated Twitter feed of competing press gallery journalists' commentary and reporting on Twitter being effectively broadcast live on the ABC's homepage, without any of the usual attendant requirements for adherence to ABC editorial policies and codes. Here were the Twitter feeds of competitors from 2UE through to The Australian, through the Sydney Morning Herald, Crikey and so on. It was a milestone really in Australian journalistic practice, which may seem minor, but in the scheme of things, seeing those walls broken down was quite fascinating and significant. Collegiality is being fostered between tweeting political journalists. Twitter's becoming a welcome addition to the landscape, David Spears told me. And the journalists I interviewed spoke of junior reporters training senior press gallery journalists to tweet. They talked about sharing information tidbit by tidbit rather than hoarding it. They discussed publicly answering one another's questions about reporting processes and assisting with corrections when mistakes were made. Pretty fascinating stuff. Those people who've previously felt locked out from journalistic processes, from the gatekeeping process. We also found that competitiveness has a new, sharper edge on Twitter. Former senior AEP political correspondent Sandra O'Malley told me she was peeved by the pressure that she felt about being pipped at the Twitter post due to the demands upon her for filing to an insatiable wire service. And that demonstrated again the emergence of Twitter as a prime site for political news dissemination, breaking political news. However, in some cases, personal rivalry has actually overflowed on Twitter in the form of publicly expressed hostility. I've personally been attacked by several journalists at The Australian over my commentary on what became known as the Grog's Gamut affair, or Groggate, and there's more to come on that issue in this presentation. But the best example of this overflow of hostility was a tweet from Bernard Keane of Crikey directed at the Australian journalist James Massola, who unmasked the blogger Grog's Gamut, in the form of the use of a single incredibly offensive word directed at this reporter. And I'm not going to offend your sensibilities or those watching online by flashing the tweet up. If you're interested, go and look it up, is my suggestion. 5, tweeting renders political reporting processes more transparent, and evidence of the increasing accountability to the public, which is something that journalists are learning to deal with via their exposure to audiences on Twitter, is found in the way that these processes are being exposed. So you see journalists discussing reporting strategies, dilemmas and difficulties, for example. And one demonstration of that in the case of the first spill was the journalists tweeting complaints about efforts to keep them away from the coalition party room where Malcolm Turnbull's fate was ultimately sealed. As I've already said, Twitter is a new dissemination point for breaking political news, and we saw that escalate with the second spill, which was hashtagged spill2, and a range of other hashtags we used. Already it had attracted some interest with QT, standing for question time, as a hashtag that aggregated political commentary and sometimes breaking news, and OzVotes, which was the tag used to aggregate all of the reporting and commentary from every tweeter in the Australian 2010 election, was another example, showing that the idea of real-time reporting and peer-to-peer news dissemination are becoming quite significant. 7th finding, while journalists continue to re-examine professional fundamentals as they negotiate their way through the Twitterverse, they in general view the platform or use of the platform as beneficial compared to risky. Benefits include the concept of individual journalists branding themselves as a brand of journalism. The idea of building a portable audience that you can take with you from one job to the next. Developing potential new audiences for their own existing employers, sourcing stories through establishment of new contacts, crowdsourcing research, providing access to different case studies and alternative views that perhaps have been muted in this age of spin within which we live. Also, they talk about the connection with other professional journalists on a global horizon-widening scale, and other journalism academics as well. Subverting spin is one thing that is considered beneficial, along with filling in the blanks on a complex story by allowing your audience on Twitter to link back to more detailed analysis. The risks are seen as competitors having the opportunity to steal your stories if you tweet about them as you develop them, competing journalists seeing your candid tweeting as fodder for print, and Bernard Keene's use of colourful language became a story of its own in The Australian as they retaliated. And potentially, with some consequences in Australia already, journalists talking about their thoughts and feelings and their private lives and their candid responses to issues in real time has actually resulted in a threat to their employment. The clash of the personal and professional spheres, the idea of not being able to segregate one part of your life from another on a platform that moves so swiftly and travels with you in the form of your mobile phone application, for example, is another issue. And then there's the old time vampire factor. That is, it sucks time out of your life and your work potentially, as well as enhancing it. Point 8, Twitter has facilitated the breaking down of barriers, and this is a very important point, that have historically isolated political journalists from media consumers. It's all about engagement now. And when it comes to politics, there's virtually no difference between journalists camped outside the party room and voters in Sydney, Perth, or the other side of the world, Bernard Keene told me. He was speaking about the collapsing of boundaries between political journalists and the people formerly known as the audience, as Jay Rosen famously wrote. Australian journalist and media consultant Bronwyn Clune repurposed Rosen's quote this way: "Journalists are the audience formerly known as the media." During the coverage of the spill, it became clear that tweeting Australian political journalists were playing a new role as audience members and consumers of citizen-generated political observation and commentary. Now, while radio talk show hosts are used to having direct contact with audiences, professional news journalists, particularly those occupying well-insulated senior positions inside large news organisations, even more particularly up on the Hill in Australia's Parliament House and the Press Gallery, have historically been shielded from direct engagement in real time with their audiences and, to an extent, the reactions of people on whom they report. The breaking down of the barriers between these journalists and the media consumer is a significant change being facilitated by Twitter. And Twitter, the spill, was a catalyst in helping to bring this change about. Have I switched that off? Excellent. I'll plough on. Fantastic. Technology, it's just magic, isn't it? Trust in journalists built on engagement has the potential to grow audiences and develop collaborative journalism. And it's important in thinking about this to acknowledge that the crisis in professional journalism that we've heard so much about isn't limited to collapsing business models. It's in part a crisis of trust and credibility. Audience engagement humanises journalists in the eyes of social media, and it grows, in the eyes of social media connections, so those people with whom journalists connect via social networking sites. It also grows potential collaboration with opportunities for public journalism, acknowledging audience contributions and knowledge, and revealing aspects of the journalist's own character and life has capacity to engender trust with audience members. And if journalism's a conversation, as it's often said, mutual respect and positive audience relationships have to be seen as critical. One of the most interesting aspects of the effect of Twitter on professional journalism is, in fact, the impact of real-time feedback on those used to being in control of the message. The chance for an instant critique of those used to shining a light on others. But how do journalists actually handle this feedback? Well, some handle it with grace, dignity, and professionalism, and actually acknowledge that enhances their practice. Others are prone to displays of professional arrogance and abuse of trust, and fail to see that such trust built on audience engagement can quickly erode respect and undermine gains. So there's now a fork in the Twitter road to journalistic transformation. 18 months ago, I wrote that journalists needed to be space invaders in the Twitter sphere. What I meant by that was that they needed to be present and engaged. But some have seen the platform's rise and the levelling effect that it brings to information distribution as a call to combat, and they've adopted principles of trench warfare, lobbing grenades at those who appear to be encroaching into their territory. This came to a head in the midst of the election campaign we just lived, with a seminal blog post by the popular blogger Grog's Gamut, who stridently criticised what he saw as the shallow, trivial campaign coverage by press gallery journalists in particular, and he called for a greater focus on policy analysis in the coverage. Some defensive journalists, evidently threatened by the disruption of control, denied that there was a problem. Others reflected thoughtfully on Grog's Gamut's critique, and the ABC's managing director ultimately even redirected news coverage to emphasise policy. The defensive ones within the pack started a flame war with critics which continued on Twitter throughout the election campaign, and then it exploded with the retaliatory unmasking of Grog's Gamut as the public servant Dr. Greg Jericho by the Australian's new recruit, James Massola. The ethically questionable original story and many of the reports and commentaries that followed in the newspaper were built, in my view, on intellectual dishonesty, attempts at self-justification and defamatory falsehoods. The Twitter storm that erupted in response was indeed volatile, and there was much criticism directed back at Massola and his Australian colleagues. The Groggate saga, as I facetiously labelled it on Twitter, perfectly demonstrated the cause of public distrust in journalism and the cost of eroding trust that's been built on audience engagement. It also highlighted the risks of disrespecting online communities and community values, mores and ethics, along with some spectacular examples of professional arrogance by some of the journalists at the centre of the storm. It was a case study in how to lose followers and alienate online communities. Those, in other words, on whom you rely to sustain your newspaper business model. And those people are indeed the people formerly known as the audience. And we'll continue to watch with interest as the journalists navigate their way through the Twitter sphere, hopefully with more pluses than minuses and more professionalism than alienation. Thank you.